I am Scott Mitchell from the Silver River Museum. And in case you've noticed, I'm not actually at the museum. I'm in my dining room because our internet signal is much stronger at home than it is in the museum because the museum's out in the woods. And hopefully one day you'll get to come see the museum. It is open on weekends. If you are out at Silver Springs State Park on the weekend, you should come by and see the museum. And teachers, I made these worksheets for your students. They're available for download from the portal. If you did not get one or you didn't download one, that is okay. They're optional, but it gives the students a place to capture some information there. And today's museum mystery object is this thing right here, which actually consists of two objects. It's used together. These things are used together. And we're going to talk about these two objects. We're going to consider it one object, but it's really two. And see, it comes apart this way. So this is this first quarter is Hispanic Heritage Quarter. And so we're talking about early Spanish explorers in Florida. And what in the world is this thing? I think that some of you may know what this is. You can look at it and probably figure it out. But I'm going to describe this to you. This is made out of metal, it's brass, and it's hollow like a little cup. You can see there's an opening there, and it has a cover that can go over it to close the opening so that dust and bugs and things don't get in there. And it's hollow right now, but it's this little brass container. And then this thing goes down inside of it. It has a sharp point and it's hollow. It's hollow inside like a straw. And this fits down in there. So teachers, I want to have your students take a minute and just think about what in the world is this contraption used for. It is important to Florida history. It's important to history all over, really. But it is important to Florida, and it's certainly important to the Spanish. And we're going to talk about that. But first, let's take a few minutes, or maybe 1 minute, and have your students talk about what they think this might be used for. I'm going to set it down. And when you get some feedback from the students, if you would, send me a chat. Let me know what they're thinking. I'd like to hear some ideas. And remember, it's really two pieces. So one of them is kind of straightforward. I have a feeling you guys are already going to know what this is. But this one, what's that? It's not a coffee cup. It's not a thermos. What could it be? So teachers, send me some chats about what the students think when you get some feedback, and we will go from there. And if you have just logged on, teachers, students, thank you for joining us. This is this week's museum mystery object. It really consists of two pieces. This is a hollow metal container. And this is a funny looking straw-shaped object that's pointed on the end. All right, I see a couple of really good answers already. Miss Marcy from Maplewood, her students say it's a pen and ink cup. Nicholas says it's a feather sharpener with a pencil to write with. We're on the right track, folks. Let's see, Quill. Quill is a fancy name for a feather or maybe a sharp hollow thing like a porcupine quill. Lanai says it's a feather. Maddie says it's a quill. Feather, something to draw with. Okay, we are on the right track, guys. You all are going to make great history detectives one day. This is, in fact, a feather, and this is an ink cup. Now, these days, we use this type of pen where you take it off, and everybody knows how a pen works. But if you think about it, there's actually ink inside this little tube, right? So the ink is stored in there and it comes out this little tiny hole when you write with it. So this is a modern pen. This is an ancient pen that used the ink that was kept in this little ink cup. And this was the kind of ink cup that was designed to sit on your desk. It wouldn't travel around. It has kind of a flimsy lid, but you would fill your ink up in there. And this is what the ink looks like. It's basically black liquid. It looks like black paint, and it's really black. And if you get it on your fingers, you're going to have little dark stains on your fingers and you'll look funny. So anyway, this is ink. This would go inside the ink cup. Here's the pen. It is made from a goose feather, although other types of birds could be used. You could use a swan feather or maybe even a crow feather, but this is hollow. And remember, the modern pen holds the ink inside. Well, the quill, the feather, holds the ink up inside this tube. And when you push the tip up against the paper, the ink comes out and you're able to write. So this is the type of pen that people used for hundreds and hundreds of years. They figured out how to make these pens back in the Middle Ages, like 1500 years ago. And before this, they were using little wooden reeds, like little tiny pieces of bamboo that would hold the ink. So it went from wooden pens to feather pens, and people used these pens up until about the middle of the 1800s. So that means when the Spanish explorers first came to Florida in 1513, about 500 years ago, what do you think they brought with them? The Native Americans that were here, the Timucuan Indians that lived around Ocala and Marion County, and well, this part of Florida, all the way from the Gulf Coast over to the Atlantic, they did not have writing. They would tell their stories down through the generations, and that's how they would pass their history down. But when the Spanish arrived, they brought with them, and this is why the quill pen is important to Spanish history, they brought with them reading and writing. And this is an actual Spanish document from the old days, many, many days ago. And I'm going to hold it up pretty close where you all can see. Now, this part up here is a stamp. This is the stamp of the King of Spain. It's his official stamp with something, something, something in Spanish. I think it's, this is the stamp of the King of Spain. And then everything down here, all of this fancy writing was done by somebody in the 1700s with a quill pen. And this is the actual piece of paper that that person held. Now, this is Spanish, but it's Old Spanish, kind of like Old English. It's hard to read. So if we wanted to understand what this said, we would first have to convert it from Old Spanish to modern Spanish. And then for me, because I'm not very good speaking Spanish, somebody would have to convert it from modern Spanish to English. So this is an actual document from, let's see, Charles III of Spain. He was in power from 1759 to 1783. So this is probably about 1770s, I think. And this is a Spanish document. And it shows you how that fancy writing was. Now, you had to really study to learn how to write with one of these quill pens, but look how they would do little fancy things off to the side just for decoration. It's much different than writing today, where it's done with a computer and everything looks the same. It's very easy to read. Even the paper is different. So because the Indians didn't record their history, when the Spanish first arrived in Florida, they wrote down what they saw, and it gives us wonderful references about Florida history and about what Florida was like 500 years ago when those Spanish explorers first came to Florida. So I'm going to show you a quick PowerPoint with a couple of interesting photographs. Here's our quill pen with the little ink bottle and a piece of paper ready to be written on. This is one of my favorite pictures. If you look closely, this fellow is writing with a quill pen. You can see it in his hand. And these gentlemen were called scribes. A scribe was someone who would use a pen to write books or write letters or stories or whatever needed to be written. And not everybody could read and write. In fact, most people could not read and write. This is from the Middle Ages, probably 1500 years ago, 2000 years ago, something like that over in Europe. And if you look closely on the edge of his desk down here, you can see three little ink pots. So this is his writing desk. Here's his quill pen, and he is hard at work putting together a book or some story or something for somebody. So this gentleman is called a scribe. Here's a close-up of that document that I just showed you. And here you can see Charles III, that's his official stamp. He was the King of Spain when this particular letter was written. Now, whoops, there's our friend the goose. And if you look out here on his wings, you see these long feathers out here. They would capture the goose, they would pull out a few feathers, it would only hurt for a second, then they would let the goose go, and he'd grow new feathers back later. And these are the feathers from the goose's wing that would be turned into quill pens. So they went through lots of pens back in the old days because they would wear out after a while. Here is a picture of some actual pens from the old days. You can see they're in a museum, so they have little numbers on them. They're like library book numbers. And if you look all the way on the ends of the pens are sharpened, and you can even see some old staining from ink. So these are actual quill pens. This is how you would buy them. A lot of times they would take the feathers off the quill pen. All right, here's a close-up of some of those sharp points, and you can see that they are hollow. They're like little straws, and that's what holds the ink. And this picture is kind of fuzzy. It's not so good, but it gives you an idea. And then this is a neat shot. There were all kinds of different ink pots or ink bottles. And so this is just an example of how a few of them might have looked. But some of them were very fancy, and they would stay on your desk the whole time, and they had little brass statues on them. And if you look at antique ink pots, there are all kinds of ink pots that were made. So that gives you an idea about quill pens and a little bit about the history of reading and writing. But the joke we always say at the museum is that if you don't like homework, you can blame it on the Spanish explorers, because they are the ones who brought reading and writing to Florida about 500 years ago. So with that, I'm going to get wild here. I'm going to risk my nice blue shirt. I've got some ink. This was Miss Benavita's idea, by the way. She said it would really be interesting if you could show the students how a quill pen worked. Now, I don't normally use quill pens, so if I end up with ink all over myself, it's Miss Benavita's fault at the museum. I have a piece of paper. This is old paper, and I have my quill pen, and I'm going to tilt the camera down. We're going to try this. And if I end up with black spots all over me, please don't laugh. Then I will see if you guys have any questions, and we can talk about this. I'm opening up, oh boy, I'm opening up the ink pot there. I'm dipping the pen. Now you can see it on the end of the pen, right? That's dangerous because it's dripping. This will be interesting, teachers. All right. Aren't we lucky we have nice pens nowadays that are so easy? Okay, I'm going to set this down. We're just going to see if we can, I'll see if I can write my name first. Oh, look at that. Oh, now see, it's already running out of ink. I have to redip it. I can understand why you would have to study and practice like a scribe to learn how to use one of these things. I just kind of scratched my name out, but it worked. It worked. And you all might even be able to, and I'm very proud because I don't have ink all over myself. Let me close this thing up before I forget. You all might be able to make your own quill pens with something like a drinking straw. And you could use maybe paint instead of India ink, which is permanent. So anyway, look at that. I signed my name. Another little interesting note is that the Declaration of Independence for the United States of America was all of the signatures were made with quill pens. And I read somewhere they had a whole box full of quill pens for all of the different people that signed the Declaration of Independence. And you can look at that online. They have pictures of it, and some of the signatures are very fancy. So teachers, before we end, please remember to send me a chat telling me who you are, what school you go to, and what grade you are, and that will help me keep track of who I am working with. So students, what did you notice? What were some of your observations about the quill pen and the ink pot? You can write some of those down on this piece of paper or another piece of paper, probably with a modern pen. And if you have some questions, I can try to answer them for you. We could talk about quill pens, but remember last time we had the museum mystery object, it was the mission bell. And I was telling you, we knew where the old Spanish missions were, the old Spanish mission churches. We know where those are because the Spanish priests and the historians wrote down their locations in old Spanish books. So that's an example of how writing is important to us because we can actually go and find those places. I see some of the teachers sending me messages about where they are and what grade they have. Thank you for that. If your students have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. We can talk about quill pens. And it also might be interesting for you to know that this ink that I have came in a powder, and I mixed the powder. It looked like black powder. I mixed it with just a little bit of water and it made ink, and it's called India ink. So teachers, if your students have questions, you can send them to me through chat. All right, I see a couple coming in. Let's talk about this. This is from Ms. Johnson. Kaylee wants to know if the container is similar to a teapot. Well, it's similar in the sense that it's considered a little pot. It holds liquid, but teapots are larger and they are made to actually warm up so you can make the tea inside the teapot hot because people like to drink hot tea. So a teapot and an ink pot are similar, but they're different. They're different in how they're used and the size, but they're similar in the fact that they both contain liquid. That's a good question. Okay, why did they use a feather? Well, remember I said that at first they were using like little pieces of bamboo or reeds, and they probably didn't last very long and you couldn't get a very good sharp point. So when they figured out that feathers would work because they're hollow, I think that's the main reason they used them, because they're hollow and they're sharp. They could trim the end to a point with a little knife. And if you know a farmer, you can get plenty of feathers, right? Because the farmer can raise geese in their farmyard, and the goose just produces feathers over and over again. So it's an easy source of pens. So they probably used feathers because they work well, they're hollow, and they're easy to get if you know a farmer. Okay, are the feathers naturally hollow or did people have to make them that way? That's a great question. They are naturally hollow, and if we think about this from a scientific standpoint, birds fly. Most birds fly. Penguins don't fly, but almost all birds fly. Well, except ostriches, they don't fly either. But most birds fly, right? One of the reasons they can fly is because they're not so heavy. If I try to fly, I just flop on the ground. It looks silly. Birds can fly because they're lightweight. And one of the reasons they're lightweight is because their feathers are hollow and their bones are actually hollow also. So they're not so heavy. So feathers are lightweight and hollow to help the bird fly. Okay. Do you have to do something special to the feather in order to write with it? Oh yes, I did some research about this. And there's this process where you peel the feather back, you get rid of all this part of the feather, so you just have the quill. And then you have to soak the feather in warm water for a little while. And then you have to stick the feather, seriously, I read all this, you have to stick the feather in hot sand, and that makes it hard and kind of cures it, they say. And then you have to take a little penknife and trim the end of the feather to get just the right shape. And there might be some junk up inside there you pull out with a little set of tweezers. And then once you do all that, you can use it as a pen. And as it gets worn out, you might have to take your penknife and shape the end of the pen a little bit again to touch it up. And as you touch it up, it gets shorter and shorter, and finally it gets worn out and you throw it away and you go catch a goose and get a new feather. Okay. Ace wants to know how old it is. Well, these items are not old. They're modern. We call them replicas. So they are exactly like the old things, but they show people what the old things looked like. We have some old things, but they're quite valuable, and I wouldn't want to take a real old quill pen and dip it in ink because I wouldn't want to mess it up. So these are not old, but they're made to look exactly like the originals. Okay. Balkan's class would know something. How long does the ink last? Well, I think if you keep the ink closed up where it doesn't dry out, it will last a long time. As long as it's in a good container, it won't dry out. And remember, it's a liquid, so if you were to leave the top off, it would just evaporate. So the ink will last a pretty long time as long as you keep it stored properly. It's like paint. If you leave the top of the paint jar off, the paint will dry up and it's no good. Those are all really great questions. Does anyone have any other questions? We have one more museum mystery episode for Spanish explorers for Hispanic Heritage Month, and then we shift over to Native American history in Florida. And we will be talking about Native Americans, or Indians, some people say, in Florida, which are very, very interesting. So that we have one more Hispanic Heritage Month museum mystery, and then after that, we shift over to Native Americans. All right. Teachers will give it another minute or so to see if anyone has any last minute questions. And remember, the whole reason that all this relates to Spanish explorers and history of Florida is because those early explorers wrote down what they saw and their experiences. And that helps us to understand what it was like in Florida when the very first Spanish explorers came and landed here about 500 years ago. Okay, I am not seeing any more questions come in, but I really like the questions that you guys asked. And I hope, oh, I see one more arm. I see one more hand up. Anyone have, there we go. Hayden wants to know, how did they get the ink? I was waiting for someone to answer that question. I researched how ink was made. Thank you, Hayden. Appreciate that. Okay, this is called India ink, and there's a reason why. I'll tell you in just a minute. But ink is basically made from the black soot from a fire. So when you light a fire and the smoke goes up, sometimes there's black soot or almost like ash that's in the smoke. And if you were to have a pot over the fire, like you were camping and you're cooking, let's say a teapot over the fire, the black soot, the black smoke would gather on the bottom of the teapot. Well, once the teapot cools off, you can scrape off that black soot into a little container, and you can mix it with some water and maybe a few other things to make it sticky. And then that's how you would make ink. So they would use soot from fire smoke, and they would mix it with water. And the reason it's called India ink, so we think the Chinese invented ink probably 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, a long time ago. The reason it's called India ink was because in Europe, they were trading with people all over the world, like the Spanish explorers, and they would get ink through India. That's where the trade routes went. So they would kind of order their ink from the Indian continent, and they started calling it India ink. So that's how ink is made, and that's why it's called India ink. All right, we have another question. Parker wants to know why they are so sharp. Well, they're sharp because you want to have a fine line when you're writing. You don't want to have a big thick line when you're writing. If you notice on these letters that are written on this old document, if you look at how fine they are, they're written pretty thin. The lines are written pretty thin. And I think that's so you can put more writing on a piece of paper. Paper was probably difficult to get. They didn't have paper factories back then. So paper was expensive and you had to make one sheet at a time probably. So they wanted a nice fine point so they could make fine lines to do delicate handwriting. All right. And how did they know a goose feather was used to write with? Well, they probably experimented with different types of feathers. They would get a feather from a duck or a feather from a turkey. And as you would test out each one of those feathers from different types of birds, you would come up with feathers that you liked best. That's probably one part of it. The other part of it is, like I said, it's easy for farmers to raise geese. They're basically farm animals. They'll hang out in the farmyard and they'll eat whatever you give them, and they're basically domesticated. They're not wild. So geese are pretty easy to raise if you know what you're doing, and they would have been easy to find, and they made nice big long feathers that were hollow. You don't want a feather that's too small, it's hard to hold. So I think that's probably why they used goose feathers. When did they stop using feathers to write with? Oh, wait, let's back up. Miss Womack's class says, Murphy wants to know, how did they get the special paper to write with? They had a whole different group of people that were making paper, and they would basically make paper out of animal hide, like leather. It's not paper, it was called parchment. Or they would make paper out of plant fibers like wood, and it's a long process, and that's a whole other lesson. But they would get paper from people who knew how to make paper. Zach says, when did they stop using feathers to write with? Oh, let's see, about the time of the Civil War. So about the middle of the 1800s. So 150, 175 years ago, they started making little metal pens that were kind of shaped just like this. They weren't pens like this. They were still pens that you would dip in ink, but the tips were made out of metal. And those were also called quill pens, but they were metal quill pens. So about 150 years ago, they stopped using feathers and they started using metal quill pens because they would last longer. You guys are really asking great questions. I like to hear it. I was waiting for someone to ask me how they made ink. All right. Any other questions? Any other questions? You guys are future historians and detectives, I think. I like the way you're thinking about this stuff. And remember, you might be able to make your own quill pen with a little drinking straw and maybe some paint. I wouldn't recommend using India ink. I think that does it for today's museum mystery object. It is a quill pen and an ink pot. And it's important to Florida and Hispanic heritage because they were the first folks to bring reading and writing to Florida. All right. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. And I really appreciate you all joining me. It's been fun, and I love your questions. Teachers, thank you so much. I will be back in 2 weeks for K2 Museum Mystery, and it will be a whole nother object. It will be our last Hispanic heritage object, and then after that, we will shift over to Native American history, which will be fascinating as well. And the Indians in Florida were very, very interesting cultures, and there is all kinds of cool stuff to talk about.
All right,
so, you all have a good rest of the day, and thank you all for joining me. Bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
that one was